Well, welcome back to the Azure podcast. This is episode number 470, being recorded on the 23rd of August, 2023. Today we have Evan and myself, Sujit. We're going to cover a whole bunch of updates that have been made recently to the Azure service. I think Evan, since it's been about 2 weeks since we recorded our last episode, I noticed there were quite a few new announcements, especially focused around AKS,
Yeah.
ACA, functions, storage, VMs, PostgerSQL, and VNETs. I thought it'd be a good time to just dive into some of them and let's
Just
see
admit
how.
it. Just admit it, Sujit. We slacked off over the summer too, right? We fell
That's
behind.
true.
We fell
Yeah.
behind on updates.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, we have not been good on updates, and the like I guess most of the product team, generally takes holidays at this time too. So even the work that
Everybody
they're
does. It's a
doing,
nice time.
yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Things will ramp
So
up this fall for sure.
yep. All right. So did you want to start with some,
Yeah, sure.
Evan?
So two of the ones that I wanted to highlight. One is the cross subscription restore for Azure virtual machines, right? This is the ability to do a restore from backup, for between one subscription to another, and this is actually super critical because if you're a small shop or you're a relatively small company, you might have all your stuff in one subscription, but very few people have all of their workloads in a single subscription, right? And so it's entirely possible that you're going, to have test or different subs, or you might do a new deployment and the new stuff's in the new subscription. It's just the ability to cross that boundary becomes super important in a lot of cases, right? So this is a nice add to that. The other one is, we announced, I think this was a little bit earlier this year, we announced that there's a managed version of Lustre, and this is for HPC workloads. And what we've done is we're continuing to expand the sort of the range of performance capabilities that you have in terms of throughput, storage, just so you can do bigger and bigger workloads, right? And that's the typical trend we see, right? Release it, get it stable, and then start making it bigger and better. Because no matter what you give people, they're going to want more. You're on mute.
Thank you. Lustre, is that our HPC storage offering? Is that what it is? I'm not actually caught up with what Lustre
Yeah,
is.
I've heard about it in the context of HPC before. I'm actually not sure whether this is an open source product that we shipping a managed one, or whether it's something that we've developed internally. I'm not close enough to it. I've seen it referenced with HPC before, but I never thought to ask, so I don't know.
Yeah. We should dive into that, and if necessary,
Yeah.
get somebody to talk about it. Sounds like an
Yep.
interesting topic. Great. Is there something else you wanted to pick up related to that, or?
From the VMs, yeah. Let's talk about AKS a little bit, then we'll come back around to some of the other base services. Sort
Sure.
of jump around a little bit.
So quite a few updates in AKS and ACA. So on the container realm. In AKS now version 1.27 of Kubernetes is generally available. So there's all the latest and greatest updates from the upstream version of Kubernetes that's been rolled into AKS. And as usual, I remember when we had George Palmer on, he explained the 2-year support life cycle and whatnot. So that'll kind of, once you kind of take that, make that a part of your cluster, you can avail of that support model. And this is this is the regular kind of rhythm for AKS and Kubernetes now, right? As new versions come up, they are validated, tested thoroughly, sometimes in preview, and then finally made available as generally available. So at this point, they're officially supported, and customers can feel free to move to that. I remember when I was talking to George when he came on to talk about the LTS support. One of the questions I had is, Generally customers shouldn't be bound to a specific version of Kubernetes, right? It's very rare when a customer workload, at least I have not seen like an application workload that is bound. So from a customer perspective, that might be just, or a customer application perspective, this might not be an issue. Just, oh, let's bump it up to 1.27, for example. But where it might come into play and where additional testing may be required is if you have vendor products that are part of your cluster, right? So if you got daemon sets that are referencing
Add-ons,
some
basically.
add-ons, very often they may break, if you do the switch to 1.27. So it's important that customers should also test this in their environment, make sure that they are specific. Because I don't think Microsoft's able to test all of the vendor compatibility. I'm sure they do some of the maybe the more popular ones, but I think customers should validate that, especially the add-ons that they're using
I
work
have seen
correctly.
I have seen some customers that are really nervous about going up in Kubernetes versions. So I definitely have seen some customers that sort of want to pick a version and stay on it, just sort of an overabundance of caution. Right, it's one less change they have to worry about. I agree with you. It's mostly the add-ons here, but it's just that feature was just so necessary for the ecosystem just to make customers feel comfortable about running on this stuff. Although I do agree with you. The Kubernetes and the containers world in general is much what's the right word? Sort of much more willing to accept that the platform's going to change underneath them, right? That's just sort of part and parcel of living in that world.
Yep, absolutely. And then kind of, I guess, related to that somewhat is ACA, right? Our Azure Container Apps, which is sort of our managed or Kubernetes as a service, or AKS as a service
As a
almost.
service, right?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. They've announced a whole bunch of updates there, right? One of them specifically is interesting to me is how you reference secrets from ACA. And typically, mounting secrets from ACA, you could go down the Kubernetes route, use Kubernetes secrets, or you'd have to somehow map, figure out a way to connect your ACA container to, let's say, a key vault and do some of the identity mapping and whatnot, which is kind of annoying to configure, honestly. But now they've made that a lot easier. You can just connect your ACA to your key vault with a managed identity, so it's part of the configuration of ACA, and automatically all your containers now have access to those secrets, right? So when the container comes up, all those secrets can be made available as environment variables simply, and your apps simply have to read the environment variables, which is a very typical way for apps to read external secrets and configuration today, and without any kind of additional work on your part. So this, I think, is a great update, especially for developers, because they're all used to working in this model where environment variables will contain the secrets, and they're now automatically made available. You can take it a step further, actually, and you can mount the entire Key Vault as a file system and read all the secrets. So if you have multiple secrets, or maybe secrets that are more than just strings, maybe they have some different content type in there, like maybe you've put a certificate, or something that's not easy, would be inconvenient to read as an environment variable. You can mount it as a file system in your app, and then just read it as files. Some of the secrets as files. So that, I think, is a nice update. There's a few more updates that I have for ACA. Should I cover them now?
Yeah, let's do those, and then I'll talk about VNet and PostgerSQL after that.
Okay. Then the next one for ACA is session affinity, right? And I'm sure you kind of know this well. You have HTTP workloads, and typically you have a number of replicas or containers of the same application running inside of your cluster or inside your ACA instance, and they also take in a kind of round robin fashion, or maybe load based. They will serve all the requests, all right, to kind of spread the load. But in some cases, it's necessary that the same client gets sent to the same instance of the container, and they call them sticky sessions. And these are typically with maybe older legacy applications that have been moved over, or maybe for performance reasons, you want to make sure that the same customer comes back to the same pod, right? So that you could store something locally in the pod, just so that you don't have to go and read it from outside, or read it from a stored source. So you can now enable that session affinity in Azure Container Apps. It will ensure that all the subsequent calls by that same customer or that same client will go straight to that same replica inside of ACA, and this will help in those scenarios. Another feature that again, this is a lot of this is kind of starting to draw parity with AKS, right? Because AKS is the full flexibility of everything you can do in Kubernetes. ACA was, okay, we'll allow you to do this much in a smaller amount of things that Kubernetes offers, but they're slowly growing that feature set to have more and more of the AKS functionality in ACA. For example, in AKS, something called init containers. You've heard of sidecars, which are a second container, like two containers in the same pod that you can have, and they can talk to each other and do complementary work. But there's also the concept of an init container, which is a container that is invoked before the main container, before the pod is started. Yeah, so you can initialize, you can do things like initializing all of your connections or your data or whatever. You can do that part of your init container so that when your application container starts up, everything's already set up. Maybe you need to warm up the sessions or whatever, all of those things that you typically do initially. And so you couldn't do that in the past in ACA, but now you can. So you can configure your ACA to have this concept of init containers, Then let me just see the next update that I have for ACA is something called CORS, also known as cross-origin resource sharing. And this is anyone who's a developer is familiar with this term. It's something that you have to deal with every time you build an API in any language, for that matter. You have to make sure that any calls that are made to that API endpoint originated from the same URL, right? It just prevents cross-site scripting attacks and whatnot. And so to kind of allow that, you have to provide some configuration data to say, okay, I'll allow an API call that comes from such and such URL domain names, right? And this way, you can kind of at least secure your API. Now you can kind of configure this inside of ACA itself. You don't have to do this. Typically, you have to do this through complicated configuration and whatnot. Now you can just tell ACA to allow those specific API calls to come in, and again, just lessening the burden for the app developer that has to push these containers.
Well, while we're on the subject of AKS and ACA, Sujit, refresh my memory. So, AKS and other managed versions of Kubernetes are all about getting me out of the complexity of having to build and manage and maintain the cluster. And then ACA is about getting me out of building and having to manage the complexity of the managed cluster, right? That sort of service as a service we were joking about earlier. It should, I'm absolutely a novice when it comes to containers and that whole world. I don't live much in that. It's all virtual machines to me. Should I always be looking at something like ACA to start with and only really expanding to AKS when I can't meet my needs with ACA? Is that like, as you're describing these, that's sort of what's going through my head, but I wanted to validate.
Yeah, it's a good question. And in the containers world, we have a number of different offerings, which sometimes makes it confusing, right? We have ACI, then we can run containers in app service, And then we can, of course, run them. Actually, we can also run them in Spring Cloud and whatnot. So we have the various places you can run containers. But typically, if you have a microservice style application where you have multiple containers that have to be hosted together and talk to each other, you would use something more like an AKS, like a cluster, right? So you can have these multiple applications that are configured to talk to each other and do something interesting. And so their choices are the AKS and the ACA. Now, AKS gives you the maximum flexibility of the full configuration, your custom security configuration, your VNet. If you have specific VNet configuration, specific image requirements, etc. That's what you'll get from AKS, right? If you have very intense requirements in that space, then you may have to use AKS. But if you're willing to say, okay, Microsoft's done a good job of securing AKS, because under the covers, ACA is using AKS, right? So it's essentially wrapping AKS with additional abstractions. And so Microsoft is doing all the hard work of ensuring that the underlying AKS clusters are secure, and is giving you saying, okay, now all you have to worry about is the application. Give me your app pods or your app containers, and I'm going to run them for you, right? And you can provide some of the configuration that we just talked about, for sticky sessions, cores, key vault access, etc. But that's where you would decide to say, okay, I'm happy with the configuration that Microsoft's going to give me, the way they're going to secure the underlying cluster, and I'll just focus on the application. But if you feel like, I have specific needs for my cluster, maybe they're for compliance or something, you feel like you have something that's very specific to your scenario, then you'd have to roll your own cluster, right? Your AKS cluster. And then, of course, as you mentioned, the kind of the extreme cases where you feel you want to have specific Kubernetes configurations which are not supported by AKS. Maybe you need
That's
to
where you go
harden
to
Kubernetes,
engine or whatever.
then you go exactly. Kind of you kind of use your VM approach, or you use some of the they used to call it
AKS engine, I think, right?
Yeah, AKS engine, correct.
Yeah.
So that's when you would go there. But there's very few customers that have gone all the way there. I do know a few, but there are very few, and most of them, at least in the financial world, have settled on AKS. And then most of the like in the startup world and more newer customers who are new to they're building an app for the first time, they're greenfield, so to speak. They would go with ACA itself, right? Because that means the least amount of work for them to do to set up that environment.
Okay, so that says I'm thinking about it right. I mean, it's all about reducing the toil on the administrator, right, of this environment, and making it so they can focus on their workload itself, right? The stuff that's sort of critical to them, and the rest of it's just infrastructure. They want to care about as little as possible, or I want to care about as little as possible.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about a couple other areas. So let's talk about PostgerSQL. So two things. One, it's a couple of weeks old, but I thought this one was really interesting, so I sort of pulled it forward to this conversation. But the ability to do major version upgrades of the flexible server variant, right? This is our latest and greatest, and sort of where we're going with the investment on it. We're not doing any more investment in the single server, but you can actually do a major version upgrade just going and setting it in the portal. It's not a big deal. You don't have to take your database offline. You don't have to migrate. You don't have to do any of that stuff. You just basically tell it, I want to upgrade. Now, got to worry about your compatibility and make sure you are compatible with that version and everything, but very, very easy to upgrade. And then the other piece is, and I'll have to confess, I assumed this was there in the first place. It wasn't, is to be able to grow your disks that are underneath while, auto grow while keeping your database online. It used to be that you'd have to take everything offline, expand the disk, bring it back online. Nobody wants to take downtime if they don't have to. Now you can set it, you can configure it to just auto grow as you need to. Again, taking away some of the administrative hassle, right? That's what all of this stuff typically is about.
And actually, on that last one, I was also for some reason my last two projects with customers I both use PostgerSQL, so I've had to use the
It's
Flex server
hugely
quite a bit.
popular, right? I mean,
I'm
it's
surprised.
yeah,
Yeah, people just love it apparently, and I'm glad that we're offering the Flex server option. But that was what I hit by default. It's 128 GB is
yeah,
the database size, and I was getting close. I was getting a little nervous what to do at that point. Luckily, it didn't cross that
yeah.
boundary. But now that we have the auto grow, it's just a matter of setting it, and then it would expand it. So that's really great to see.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, doesn't mean your performance is going to stay the same, so you still got to manage your performance. But yeah, at least you don't have to worry about the disk. The other one was this goes back to sort of my old days, but virtual network flow logs. So we've had flow logs for virtual machines for a while. So a flow is a protocol and a port and a destination, or a source and a destination, right? So UDP, source port 5,000 or 50,000 and destination port 5,000 to a specific VM, or TCP, similar combinations. But now you can track and manage all the flows that are within a given VNet, and see these will show up in the traffic analytics capabilities of, I think that falls under Azure Monitor. Or no, I'm sorry, not Azure Monitor. Uh,
Sentinel or something, or
no, it's Network Monitor. I
network monitor.
think is within the I'll look it up while we're talking here, but it's the network monitoring capabilities within Azure. There's an entire product that I'm completely spacing on. That team's probably going to yell at me later because I've worked with them a bunch over the years. But now you can see the VNet flow logs, across your entire virtual network. Again, seeing what traffic's going on in your environment. Who are the top talkers? Are there flows that you're sort of surprised about? Are there flows that that you maybe need to lock down that you weren't aware that were happening? Just gives you some insight to that. Now, again, this probably goes hand in hand. You're going to make some firewall rules or whatnot based on what you see in here, but it's great to have this diagnostic capability.
And it's interesting that they call them flow logs because you're not actually seeing the data, right? You're just seeing kind of which direction it's flowing. Is that why they call them flow logs? I'm assuming because
That's a good
it's
question.
encrypted. Because encrypted, you can't really see the data, right?
Yeah, I'm not really sure where the name comes from, but that is a pretty standard name when you're talking about the metadata about the actual connections, right? You're definitely not able to get the actual, packets and everything that are going there. You're seeing the source destination protocol, right? But yeah, I'm not exactly sure where that name comes from. Network Watcher is the product
That's right.
that this falls under.
Okay, very good. I had a couple of updates on Azure Functions that I can cover now. So in Azure Functions, we've always had the concept of using triggers and bindings, right? So we could say a function will be triggered when such and such event happens in a storage queue or a service bus topic. And then you can write to some output binding or receive input for some input binding, right? So those are the kinds of the bindings. And the bindings have typically been, one of these types like queue or topic or like a blob storage.
Yep.
But now, if you use .NET as your language for the function, you have expanded binding types. You can use SDK types. In other words, specific SDK classes as binding types. Like, they're not limited to just the ones that are offered like that connect to external queue, but you can just pass in, for example, the blob client, right? Blob client is the client that's used to connect to your blob service. And now your function can do all sorts of things with the blob client. Maybe it's downloading a big file, it's processing it, and it can do it like maybe it's something that takes an additional amount of time to do it, and you can kind of finish all of that work with that SDK type because it has access to the full SDK type. So it's kind of expanding some of the use cases where you possibly couldn't use triggers and functions and bindings before. Now you can because you're giving you those additional SDK types. But again, it's limited to .NET because it is an SDK type, so you have to be a .NET type. But certainly, I think from a developer perspective, this opens up a whole bunch of scenarios.
Is there just a list of certain SDKs that I can use, or can I do, any sort of dynamic class that I create and define the rules around that?
It's generally like a a small list which is outlined,
Okay.
like
Okay.
their service bus, essentially the same triggers that were there before, but you get the full access to
Gotcha.
that
Okay.
topic or that subscription or that blob client. You get all of it, not just, oh, here's the
Yeah.
input that I received
Yeah.
versus,
Gotcha.
oh, here's the entire class. You do what you want with it, right?
Yeah. You basically bring this up a level in terms of the layer at which you're able to see the object and manipulate it, right? Instead of just being limited to a couple pieces of whatever we
Right.
chose to expose. Now you have, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. And then another kind of update again, specifically for .NET functions. So the especially the isolated .NET isolated model, and most of them use application insights for telemetry. And now but controlling things like what kind of filters, filtering rules, or the log levels, etc., has always been something that you would have to do in your app, and now you could. That's been a little more easily externalized. You specify in your application startup, you can specify, all of these settings, and they automatically get flowed to your .NET isolated function. So this is the integration of application insights into the .NET Worker model. That's something new. And again, I think I know I've faced some of the pain here in configuring this inside of a function, and this will be very helpful. You just have to specify there's a host.json file where you go and specify some of the
Yep.
settings, and everything will get picked in from there.
Yep. Yep. Cool. And then the last one that I wanted to highlight was, and we were chatting before the show. I'm kicking myself because I was talking to the team that shipped this product and sort of dropped the ball on getting them on the show. But we're continuing to expand the capabilities of the Elastic SAN, right? So the Elastic SAN, Azure Elastic SAN. Geez, I can't talk to the Azure Elastic SAN, not Stan. Is basically a SCSI interface that you can connect up to. And now we're adding in the ability to do private endpoints, right? So if you really want to lock this traffic down so that it's going through a private IP, and you can target it better rather than going through the public IPs, which customers generally don't like, especially the type of customer that uses things like SANs. And so this just allows to give some more functionality there. And
Yeah,
I made a note to myself to go chase them down and see if we can get them on the show again.
Yeah, I think that's a big feature in Azure. I think providing
Yeah.
that managed SCSI interface. I guess that's the
Yeah.
best way to explain it.
Yep.
Because there's a lot of applications that still require that, especially
Yep.
the more legacy style applications. Maybe the application servers, right? What used
Right.
to be called the J2E servers, the WebLogic of the world, or maybe an SAP and others. So that's something that is certainly worth digging into.
Yeah, it's sort of funny, you think about these the cloud started out as just sort of virtual machines, doing various workloads, and a lot of it wasn't even VMs, it was these stateless workers, right? Web workers and web roles and worker roles. And now we got virtual machines, and then now these big, I mean, like I said, is a big on-premises piece of hardware. I mean, like these are not little things you put under your desk, and now even things like that are virtualized, sitting in the cloud somewhere. And again, it's just an interface, so we don't, Microsoft doesn't have a SAN sitting there somewhere that we're exposing, right? It's sitting on top of our storage standard storage infrastructure. But it's just kind of neat to see that some of these things, I almost feel like this is going to be some, you and I will be talking about a SAN in 10 years, and it's sort of like, man, there's like 5 people that know SAN still, but it doesn't ever, it's like COBOL, right? Like there's still a market for COBOL.
It's never gonna go away. Yeah.
But it's just sort of smaller, and it's some defined scenarios, and when you need it. But you're certainly not building. I don't think anybody's building new stuff with SANs. If I had to guess, but it can't go away. You can't just completely ignore that stuff.
Yeah,
Right.
and definitely helps customers that want to bring workloads
Yeah,
into Azure. That can be the
absolutely.
blocker. So this helps them get over that.
Yeah. I just
So
know oh, sorry. I was just gonna say, if you'd have said, Evan, you'd still be talking about SANs, 15 years into the cloud world, I wouldn't have believed you back then. But yeah, it makes total sense now. Sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, so we've covered a number of updates today. Can you tell me one topic that we have not covered which has not been covered in the past 2 weeks.
In the past 2 weeks. Now wait a minute. Doesn't the major version upgrade thing count? I brought that in. That wasn't technically today.
No. I mean, I'm just
Oh.
saying, like, can you think of a topic that that was not covered, that we have not covered, something that's very hot?
You talking the OpenAI stuff?
Yeah, I'm just surprised that in the last 2 weeks there's been no OpenAI announcement.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. I wonder if they're working up to something big, maybe.
That's right.
Start...
I was just looking at it like, wait a minute, there's nothing on
Yeah.
OpenAI here.
And just to be clear, in case anybody thinks differently, like, we don't have any special insight into something big coming. This is
Correct.
truly just observing and seeing. So yeah, that's a good point. Those have been coming fast and furious recently, and I don't see anything. We'll have to keep an eye out for it. I'm sure there'll be an announcement on something soon. That's just such an interesting area.
You could look at it in one way, saying that service is pretty secure, pretty full-featured, robust. There's no need for any more updates. But I'm sure we'll get some more. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. That's funny. Cool.
Great.
Okay.
This was really great. Thanks for discussing all of these new updates with me today.
Yeah, it's a good way to come back from vacation, is to sort of reinforce in my head some of all the stuff that's been going out while the world didn't stop just because I went away for a little while.
It's good to have you back.
Thanks, Sujit. Catch you later.